Morning, everybody. My name is Jeremiah Vardiman. I'm with UW Extension. Today I'm going to be talking about Palmer Amaranth, a new invasive weed in the state, or in the area, I probably should say. But let's have a conversation about it. I don't know how much you know about this, and that's kind of the point of it, is just to make you aware of it, make sure you know what to be looking for, what to know, and move forward. So by no means, I don't have a problem if you want to stop me, let's talk, let's have a conversation. I don't always like death by PowerPoint. But, so what I want to cover is just how to identify the plant. That's going to be the biggest thing. Any weed that we want to talk about, we want to first be able to have proper identification. And we're going to talk about the challenge of doing that with this specific weed. So it's not as easy, it's not very distinguishing. It depends on the growth stage, it depends on your familiarity with it. So identification is going to be big. We're going to talk about potential impact of the Bighorn Basin crops, which is Riverton's crops, right? Malt barley, sugar beets, dry beans, corn, hay, all that, right? Probably some alfalfa seed, I believe, down here, things like that. So our crops are very similar to yours. We focused this presentation on the Bighorn Basin just because we have Palmer Amaranth up there. So big news alert there. And so we're trying to talk about that. And then we're going to finish it up. It'll be a little dry there at the end, but it'll just be management options, or maybe the lack thereof of management options. So we'll try and provide that and just help you move forward. So the big message I want everybody to be aware of is we have Palmer Amaranth. So if you're not familiar with Palmer Amaranth, it's a part of the Amaranth family. It is, so we have multiple amaranths in Wyoming, here in Riverton. Red pigweed is probably the most common amaranth species that people are aware of. But there's also two other species that I'm aware of that are in the area, but we just don't recognize them. They're not a major pest or a nuisance, and not as big of a concern. So that would be Powell amaranth. I can't think of the third one. But then now we have Palmer Amaranth. So historically, Palmer Amaranth is a native species out of the southwest part of the United States. So this is kind of unique in that we are dealing with a native species to America. That's typically not what we see as our common weed species, right? That plant then got moved out of the southwest part, so we're talking Arizona, New Mexico, down into Mexico, and it got moved to the southeast into Alabama, Mississippi, that type of thing. It's now a huge problem up in the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, all that. If there's any such silver lining or positive thing about Palmer Amaranth, at least back east, if you ever watch anything with the agronomics back there, the crops that they're growing, the only thing I can tell you is they are still able to farm with Palmer. And they are mostly corn and soybean production out there. So they're still able to grow crops and to have agriculture back there in the Midwest. It's still challenging. There's some things that we need to talk about it. But a lot of times when you hear about Palmer Amaranth, it'll just devastate, you can't grow any crops, and some of this presentation is not going to be the most rosy of picture of it. But just want you to know that it's a mindset shift. We got to change our management, look at how we can maneuver this to manage it. But it is a problem, and it can become a problem. So it first was identified in Goshen County in Wyoming, there in the southeast. It's also been identified in Platte County, so down there in the southeast. They've had it for, I don't know, but probably at least 7-8 years that I am aware of down there in those counties. So they're still farming down there. The last information that I learned from the Panhandle of Nebraska, they have Palmer Amaranth really bad. But the big thing that I learned in that one is, at least the media coverage, the information that we are hearing coming up into my area was that once you have Palmer, it's just everywhere and it's a problem. Well, even in the Panhandle, they've had Palmer Amaranth for probably 12, 15 years or more. It's not in every field yet. It's very patchy, is what I understand. So it'll be in this area, and then there's areas that don't even deal with it. But when you do have it, it's a problem, right? So I think that's some silver lining, that just because If you have Palmer amaranth growing here in Riverton, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to be affected all at the same time. It's not going to spread to everything, but it's something to be aware of and to be concerned about. So in 2022, we identified Palmer amaranth for the first time in the Bighorn Basin. It was actually found in 2 locations, and 2 locations that are completely different sites than you would anticipate. So it was first found in the fall of 22, I want to say August, about middle of August. It was identified in a farmer's field in Worland in sugar beets. And so there was an edge of a sugar beet field. They'd made their 3rd application of glyphosate on the Roundup Ready sugar beets, and there was this patch of weeds that was not controlled, and they thought that was really odd that glyphosate hadn't cleaned up the field. They picked that plant, took it in, and got it identified. Come to find out it was Palmer amaranth. They did extensive work with their weed and pest to try and get it out of the field. They went in with hand crews and picked all of it, bagged it, burned it. When they dug those sugar beets, they dug those sugar beets last. They hauled them to the sugar factory there in Worland in a separate load. And then when they were there, they actually took the tear dirt off of those beets, loaded it back up, and hauled it back onto that farm. So they did everything they could to isolate that, to keep the weeds from spreading, to keep the weed seed where it was, that type of thing. And they monitored that area until, I want to say, October, and they were out there walking every week trying to catch any new growth of sugar beets, or excuse me, not sugar beets, of Palmer amaranth. And they had Palmer amaranth germinating until the temperature got cold there at the end of September. So they did huge diligence to try and control it, contain it, stop the spread of it. There was also another site, I want to say approximately 10 miles from that farm, that they found and identified a Palmer amaranth plant as well. I don't know as much detail on that site. So that was in Worland in Washington County in the fall of 22. Interestingly, and I don't know, the stars aligned or something, I'm not 100% sure, but up in Cody, they found Palmer amaranth. The same fall, and I want to say that was in September, and the interesting thing with that one was it was underneath a bird seed feeder at the animal shelter in Cody, Wyoming, is where they found that the Palmer amaranth growing. And again, a worker at the facility at the animal shelter was like, what is this? And took it to their weed and pest office, and they identified it as Palmer. And so totally different landscapes, not where you would anticipate to find it, things like that. So that was 2022. In that winter, November through March, we formed a working group in the Bighorn Basin. We called in all the stakeholders that we could think of. We being the University of Wyoming, we tried to just start the conversation. What is Palmer? What do we need to know about it? How do we approach it? Weed and Pest was at the table. All our ag industry was at the table. Our Simplot Co-op, ag lenders. I mean, we had like 60 people in the room to start that discussion, and it boiled down into a working group, which we were really excited about to have and to try and push. So for 2023, would it be? Yep, 2020, excuse me, I got my dates wrong. It was fall of 2023 that it was found. In 2024, we pushed out a lot of educational material on Palmer amaranth and trying to educate everybody about it. So that was a big bulk of our push. Last year, in 2024, we had Palmer amaranth found in Bighorn County was the big spread. They really monitored that sugar beet field. I believe it got rolled over into a barley field, but they still found Palmer amaranth in that same spot of the field. They monitored it closely. They sprayed it, did a pretty diligent job there. New locations that we found was the highway between Grable and Emblem. We found Palmer amaranth growing along the shoulders on that highway there. And then we also found Palmer amaranth on the highway into Powell, south of Powell there. Again, growing on the roadside. We don't know how it is spreading. It doesn't technically matter how or why it's spreading. We're not going to stop it. But it indicated to us that it's possibly equipment moving through. Sure. Somebody, it's bouncing off of those trucks or equipment, or maybe it's cattle trucks. It's hard to say, right? But that's where we found it. That's where the spread of it. So that was a good thing to be able to watch it, to monitor it, and keep track of it. So that's where it is, but we want people to be aware that Palmer amaranth is here. The other thing that happened in the summer of '24, Park County Weed and Pest went to the local box stores, Ace Hardwares, Walmart, Baumgars, Murdoch's, and they pulled samples of bird seed off of the shelves. And so they pulled, I think, they found 7 different bird seed mixes, and they range from a pound to 25-pound bag, and they took them to the seed lab in Powell and had those analyzed. And they looked at those bird seed bags, and they found Palmer amaranth in every bag, 100%. And it tended to correlate. There were some bags that had 5 seeds of amaranth. So the seeds you cannot identify between Palmer or red root pigweed by just visually looking. You'd have to send it off for a DNA analysis to know. But there was amaranth species in every bag. The bags that tended to have a mix specifically with millet in it tended to have a higher percentage of amaranth seeds in the bag. And that makes sense. They're similar in size, right? So your millet is really small seed, and it's hard to clean out small seed from small seed kind of idea, okay? So that was not really the most rosiest. We can talk about that later, but just understand that bird seed has different laws and regulations than the rest of your seed, okay? Bird seed is considered a forage. It's not seed. So it falls under different laws and regulation. And thus, they technically don't have to clean Palmer amaranth out of the bird seed. So anyway, we have Palmer in the Bighorn Basin. It would not surprise me if it was here in Riverton or Fremont County, or eventually it will make it here. You guys we're trucking the same distance, we're using the same ports, we're using the same markets and things like that, especially sugar beets. I believe your guys' sugar beets go up to Worland. Is that correct? Okay. So, I mean, there's just a good chance of that movement and contamination. The birds will move that seed as well. So we're talking geese. All are migratory birds in that regard. So they could bring it down. A lot of what I've heard in the Midwest in that is if you want to look for and scour your landscape for Palmer amaranth, they don't look at crop fields. They actually look at fence rows, power lines where the birds are roosting. That's where they would identify Palmer first, is going to be in those type of landscapes. But we need all eyes watching. We can't rely just on Weed and Pest or other agencies to find this for us. We need everybody out there and watching. Watch your fields, watch your ditches, watch your roadways. Interestingly enough, we sent out a flyer identifying Palmer amaranth, sent it out to everybody, and we got a phone call, and the guy said, hey, I got one growing under my mailbox. Come look at it. And that's how we found it along the roadside. And we started there at his mailbox, started walking the highway, and it went for 5 miles on either side of the highway. But it was because he found it right there under his mailbox. Personally, I drive by that mailbox every day to work, and I didn't identify it or see it. So we need everybody looking, okay? So big one, anytime we talk about weeds or any type of plant, but especially our weeds that we're trying to control, we need to be able to identify Palmer amaranth. So this is really, really challenging. Once you know what you're looking for, it's not that challenging, but the first time seeing it, I really don't know. And most of it has to do with all those other amaranth species. They're very similar. The big one for us here in Riverton is red root pigweed. I'm sure you guys have that in every crop field. You're managing for it in your ditches, in your edges of your fields and things like that. Palmer amaranth looks very similar, almost identical to red root pigweed. So it's going to be a challenge to look for it, but I'll try and give you some hints and clues of how to look at it and what to look at. But the thing you want to know, and I want to emphasize, and why this is such a big concern for everybody, is it's an annual plant, right? And it has prolific seed production. That's very common with annual plants. They produce a lot of seeds because that's how they reproduce and grow and spread, because they don't grow from roots. But the other big part of this that's different than red root pigweed is they have an explosive population growth. And so the example I can give you is if you have, let's say, 5 plants in your field this fall, and you harvest that, let's say it was barley, you harvest that, it can be such an explosive population growth that the following year you have Palmer amaranth everywhere in your field the next year. And so it can be that quick. And so it's really important to understand and find that plant when you have a small population of it, just so you can be prepared to protect the entire field the next year. Unfortunately, I would love to have that EDRR that our weed management councils and districts really preach. Early detection, rapid response, let's kill it, let's get rid of it. With this one, I don't know if we can do that. But definitely the earlier you can find it, the better off you're going to be. But I don't think we can eradicate it if we get on it soon enough. But we can start kind of controlling it and managing the damage for the next year. So the first one is going to be the plant shape of how to identify it. It looks like a poinsettia. So if you ever have those poinsettias for Christmas or that, it's going to have that kind of very symmetrical leaf arrangement. So if you're looking straight down at the plant, those leaves are going to be spaced almost just perfectly apart. And it's going to just have that nice pattern to it. Red root pigweed is really condensed. You can see how compact it looks. Now we're talking in generals, okay? It doesn't always work out this way, and that's what makes it so hard identifying. But these are 2 great examples to give you the extremes. So those leaves are really tight to the stem. They're very compact, and you can see that they're not perfectly spatially aligned as they are out here. With that Palmer, it's almost like the leaves are you could measure them, they're equally separate from each other. Whereas the red root pigweed, they don't quite match up. They kind of overlap each other and are very compact. So that's kind of the first one. The big tell for Palmer amaranth, and this is before we get to a seed or a seed head to help us out, is this what is called the petiole. And the petiole attaches the leaf blade to the stem of the plant, right? For Palmer, that petiole is really long. It's going to be as long as the leaf blade or longer. And so if you bent that petiole right here, folded that over on the leaf, it's going to be as long as the leaf blade or longer, okay? Not always. There's anomalies in nature, and she wants to throw you curveballs. But a majority of them found, especially lower down on the plant, the more mature leaves are going to fit that commonality, okay? Red root pigweed, you're going to struggle to get that petiole to be the same length as the leaf blade. They can. I have seen it. They can be the same length as the leaf blade, generally not longer. So if you have that long petiole, I'd start suspecting Palmer, okay? Does that make sense? The other thing to look at, and again, this one, we're giving you the best examples on both extremes. For Palmer, the stems are very shiny, smooth, hairless, or very, very sparse hairs on it, okay? Red root pigweed is very fuzzy. They're very small hairs, very fuzzy. They're not a smooth stem or that. However, with red root pigweed, but also with Palmer, there could be some hairs on that stem. So if it does have hairs, does not mean it's not Palmer, right? With red root pigweed, I've seen some that are pretty smooth hairs that have very little bit of hair on it. And so just because it's not super hairy does not mean it's not red root pigweed. So it's really hard to tell, but those are some to help you out. If you get to a seed head, this is helpful. So for Palmer amaranth, they have these long stalks for the seed head. And for both of them, for red root pigweed and for Palmer, they are male and female plants. Okay? So they don't have the same reproductive organs on the same plant. They're individual plants. So it's a male plant and a female plant out there. Not that I expect you to know the difference or to identify that, but this long stalk is very characteristic of Palmer amaranth. You're going to see that. This is red root pigweed. You can see how those seed heads are more compact again. Everything's compact, and you don't have that long seed head. So that's a good telltale between the two. Now, Palmer Amaranth can put a seed head on at 4 inches tall. It doesn't have to get tall. The plants that we found along the highway there south of Powell this last summer, those plants were anywhere from probably 8 inches tall to 2 feet tall. A lot of times everybody's like, oh, you'll know it's Palmer because it'll be over 10 feet tall. Not always, right? It depends on when that seed germinated. It depends on the site that it germinated in. It depends on the nutrients that are available to it. And at least my understanding is those plants will grow as big as they need to be. So on the shoulder, there's not much competition. They don't need to grow 10 feet tall, so why would I? But if I'm in a cornfield, Palmer Amaranth really needs to stretch and get above that corn, and it can grow taller than corn. So that's another telltale sign that way, and it can put inflorescence on and viable seed on at 4 inches tall. Okay? So what is the potential impact to our crops? First of all, the biggest concern everybody has, and they're dealing with in the Midwest, is herbicide resistance. Palmer Amaranth can develop herbicide resistance very, very quickly, and to a lot of modes of action, right? Compared to red root pigweed, there's only 3 modes of action that we are aware of that red root pigweed has a developed resistance to. So it's very quick, and it has to do with that seed production and the way it produces that seed. It sets it up to being able to develop resistance very quickly because of the massive amount of seed production it does, but also because of the male-female plants reproducing. So this is a kind of a confusing chart, but what we got is the herbicides down the side of the chart here. And this is a comparison of those herbicides to control Palmer Amaranth in comparison to red root pigweed. So these are the chemicals we're using in different crops for red root pigweed control. And so looking at this, the closer to 0 or this solid line, the more likely we're going to have similar control of Palmer Amaranth as we see with red root pigweed. Does that make sense? So if you start going down, so these are, the closer these dots are to this solid line, the better our chances are of controlling that. So if you start going across, you got Risto, Reflex Raptor, Permit, Outlook, Dual, Cultivation, so that's not herbicide of course, glyphosate, until it develops resistance, right? Glyphosate works until it develops resistance, and then that's off the table. And the same with all of these, right? So Prowl, Eptan, those kind of things. You start getting into 2,4-D, Curtail, Wide Match, Starring, Curtail. They're not going to perform as well. Can they? They'll give you some control, but I would not rely on them. They're not an effective herbicide. Does that make sense? If you start looking at these, a lot of them are going to be your pre-emergent herbicides. And that's what we need. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's your probability. These are our best possible controls. These are our worst for Palmer Amaranth. Okay? Compared to red root pigweed, well, you know, I'm dealing with red root pigweed. How bad is it going to be? Palmer Amaranth, we found, is germinating earlier in the spring. Not significant. We could be talking a week up to 3 weeks earlier than red root pigweed. Palmer Amaranth starts growing. It's more tolerant to the heat, which kind of sounds weird, right? But if we start hitting July, August, you know, we can hit 95, 90, 100, a little over 100. That Palmer is going to tolerate the heat better. It can continue to germinate through that heat. It can put on seeds, things like that. It grows faster. That's one of the big things that's very characteristic of Palmer. You go find it today, you go look at it again tomorrow, it can grow 3 to 5 inches in a day. Just depends on all the environmental conditions, right? It's very competitive against our crops. It's difficult to control with herbicides like we talked about, especially with the resistance that can develop quickly. And it develops that herbicide resistance easier than red root pigweed. So it's similar to red root pigweed. Everybody kind of talks about it as red root pigweed on steroids. So what do we expect? So the two crops that we're most concerned about are dry beans and sugar beets. So that's where we're going to see the most impact to our crops is our speculation. So this is one Palmer amaranth or one red root pigweed in a row every 3 feet. That's not really that dense of a weed population. But even that light of a weed population, we're seeing some significant impact to the crop. So we could potentially, especially for Palmer amaranth, for sugar beets, we're looking at possibly 50% yield loss, 65% of dry beans, and that's without control, right? Why we're concerned with these two crops is we have minimal control for those crops, in those crops. Sugar beets, we have pretty much glyphosate as a post-emergent herbicide. Same with dry beans. We run out of our herbicides, especially later in the summer. So if you take that, how much yield impact that could be, this is what it would generate revenue-wise or loss of revenue because of that weed impact. This is why we're concerned about it. This is why we're talking about it. Is just like all crystal ball predictions, we were talking about the weather this morning. Is this what's really going to come through and happen? It's hard to say. This is the best information we have, the best projection. Some people are pretty worried when we start talking 51% or 65%. That's enough. If it really is that bad, we could lose those markets to grow for. So that it's a big concern. We don't know if it'll really happen. So the question is, well, what do I do about it? Boy, I wish this was a better, I had better information to help you, but it's going to be limited. It's going to depend on what crops you're growing, how your crop rotations and things like that are. Overall thoughts. Dry beans and sugar beets, we already talked about, are the most vulnerable. Corn, small grains, and forages, we are going to have the best for chemical control options in those crops. So that's a good thing. So if you don't have those a part of your rotation, let's try and work those into the rotation if possible, because at least you'll have some herbicide control in some of those off years, right? Most effective control is when plants are germinating 4 inches or less. So think about that. Doesn't matter if you have effective herbicides, if that weed is over 4 inches tall, which is not very tall, your herbicides are not going to effectively control that plant. That's hard. Then to make it even more challenging, they have long germination period, fast growth, which are going to be challenging to time those applications. And the challenge is going to be if they start germinating, let's say the first week of June, and they can germinate and grow all the way to the end of September, how do you go out and control all that? Right? And if you go out and do a perfect job, let's say in the springtime, that end of June, and you hit it hard, the plants are at the right stage growth, you have the right herbicide, and you get out there and hit that field and do a good job, next week some more germinate, and off they go. And it's like you didn't even control them. And so it's going to take a series of applications, it's going to take a series of control measures. The other aspect that we're probably not as used to and should be thinking about, especially for crops like malt barley that comes off so early, that residual of the field, we need to be scouting that part of the field and controlling that until it stops germinating as well. Even though we have good control methods in that crop. Can you see the challenge and the issue with this though? So just make sure you're aware of that this is definitely a weed that I stepped on it good, I got a good application, we're done. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Use of soil activity herbicides, if available, is going to be huge. This is going to be critical. Using your pre-emergent herbicides is going to be huge. If you can get those laid down, and if they're labeled in the crop, that's the best thing you can do. The other part of that is if it's all dependent on the crop, and that's where our sugar beets and dry beans falls down for us. But if you can overlap the residuals of those pre-emergent herbicides, the longer you can stretch that into the growing season, the better your chances of control are. This is how they're controlling it in the Midwest and other states that are full of Palmer amaranth, is a lot of soil activity herbicides, and they're overlapping those residuals as much as possible to try and give you control. But as you are aware, we can't do that for the whole year, no matter what. Like it's gonna break down at some point where we're struggling, okay? Glyphosate is effective, so don't think that, oh, if I'm growing sugar beets that my glyphosate's not helping me. It works until it's resistant.
What is the length of time usually that you notice? Is it a couple years, 3 years, or does it just vary?
In terms of what?
The resistance.
Oh, it varies, but it can develop within 2-3 years from what I understand of the literature. It's really, really quick. And then the other problem that we are not aware of, we haven't looked at this, we haven't tested of the known populations that we have, what resistance are they coming with, right? And that depends on where they came from, how they got to us, and we don't know that. I'm gonna suspect the one that population that was identified in Whirlwind, I think we can comfortably say that one is glyphosate resistance. That's why they found it in their sugar beet field and why it stood up. But what else is it coming with? And most of those populations have multiple resistance. It's not just this population is resistant to one herbicide and this one's different. No, the same population could be resistant to all of those herbicides or a combination of them, right? So, but it's very quick. I'd say 2 to 3 years at the shortest. It could take a little longer. And there's a lot of variables to that, right? How often are they being sprayed and with what chemical, that kind, and the timing of that chemical. And that's where getting them sprayed where they're smaller, you're gonna have a better chance. If you're spraying them where they're 6 inches or taller, we're actually just perpetuating that resistance. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
Good question, good question, man. So dry bean herbicide options. So again, our PPIs, we really got to get that trifluralin, eptan, or not eptan, excuse me. I'm not even going to butcher that name. Get that in, do it, work it in with your tillage, right? Usually those have to be incorporated. And a lot of times people will put it in on their roller harrow, or they'll spray the field and then roll the field. But get those worked in. Then our pre-emergence, right? Get those worked in, especially if you're in a sprinkler system. Of course, it's easier, makes it easier. If you're on flood, it's hard to work in, but still, if you have the ability, get it going. Then our post options, and this is where we really fall down, right? But we do have some combination there, but once we develop ALS resistance to that, the palmer having ALS resistance to those herbicides, we're done, right? We've lost our post-emergent, and that's why dry beans are such a concern for us. But that's the approach that we need to take coming through, trying to use and heavily use these soil-active herbicides to control those plants as much as possible. And as you know, with your pre-emergent herbicides or any of those soil-active herbicides, they're only effective if the weed has not germinated yet, right? It kills the radical and the germinating seed in the soil. But once that plant is up out of the soil, they have no control on that. So we got to really do our due diligence and have a clean field, then put our pre-emergent down to try and have the best control. Does that make sense? We good with that one? Sugar beet herbicides, again, same thing. We have this has little activity on pigweed, so we don't even really have a good pre-emergent herbicide. We got glyphosate, but once it hits resistance, we lose that one. These can work. The one I do not have up here, other post-applied, but we just have, again, they're suppressed. They're not that effective of herbicides. We don't have that many options. How do we get through the growing season? There is a new herbicide that they are looking at. It's called Gold Ticks. Scotts Bluff, the UNL Research Center out of Scotts Bluff has been doing a lot of research with that chemical. They're using it. They have an emergency use exemption label for that in Colorado, Nebraska. Last I heard, we were working on trying to get that exempt label to use Gold Ticks here in sugar beets. They've had some pretty good results with that one. So if you're growing sugar beets or know somebody, have them talk to the company. That's where that emergency exemption label is going to come from. It's from producers and from the industry. They really got to push that. So it's possible that we might get another herbicide here that would help us out, but again, it's only one. Maybe a silver lining. So far, Palmer Amaranth, I'm not aware that it has developed any resistance to our soil-active herbicides, and Gold Ticks is one of those. So that's a positive thing to help us out with that. It's not the saving grace though, but at least we have something. Small grains, as we talked about, we have a lot. We have a lot of herbicides that are going to do good. Palmer Amaranth's a broadleaf weed, so most of those herbicides are going to work. The Prowl, that's going to be your pre-emergent herbicide. You got buck trail growth regulators. 2,4-D and dicamba will work on it, but they're just, again, it's going to be a timing of those plants. And so if you hit them this week, in 2 weeks, I'd be scouting that field again. And then it becomes an economics of the crop production. How many applications can I tolerate and still stay viable as a business? Let's see, a lot of them don't have Palmer on the label is what I'm trying to say here, but pigweed can control. So you will have some effect from those different herbicides out there. They will work. Gramoxone and AIM, those are going to work good for burn down. So if you have a field, let's say your barley's been harvested and you want to burn down the field, you can burn those down. Remember, Gramoxone or Paraquat, you need, it's a restricted use pesticide, so you need to have your license for that, but then also there is a product specific labeled training that you have to take before you can purchase and apply that. So be aware of that. And these are just contact. So they're going to just work to burn it down. So if you're late in that season, even if it has a seed head on it, you can burn that plant down to kind of shut down the seed production. But whatever seed is on the plant is viable, you're just burning it down. It's not affecting the seed. Does that make sense? Corn. Corn, we have numerous options for herbicides in corn, right? The big thing I want you to be aware of with corn is we don't, how to say this, if you have it in corn, the biggest challenge in corn is going to be knowing that you have it because that corn grows just as fast. And if you start having, and this is Palmer Amaranth sticking out the tops, you see those tips, those seed heads? That's taller than the corn. If you're at that stage, it's game over. You have no control options. And so finding it in a cornfield is going to be your hardest part just because that corn is so tall, it grows so quickly. That Palmer can be hiding in there and you don't even know it and shouldn't know that you shouldn't be applying for it. But if you do have it, and that's again, finding it this year, then that sets up your program for next year, right? And laying out those herbicide regimens throughout the growing season for your corn. We can manage it if we know it's there and we're spraying for it. Does that make sense? So corn, we have a lot of herbicide options. Talk to your dealers. But the biggest problem is just knowing I have it in that field. Hay production, we don't have, it depends. So if we're talking alfalfa, we don't have much control options in alfalfa. But you can put a dormant season herbicide. We're talking November to March before that plant breaks dormancy with Chateau or Syncor. Early dormancy break to early bud, you could do Prowl if you got late, right? That plant broke on you, you didn't get your Chateau down or Syncor, you could do Prowl. That would probably fit more under a sprinkler system. You're not going to get probably enough water to incorporate that in a flood field. For grass, you have Prowl still, but post-emergence. So you have Vermoxanil. You also have all your growth regulators, so dicamba, 2,4-D, you could still use those so it would work. Alfalfa seed is going to be kind of similar to that. Again, Chateau, Syncor in a dormant season, and then your Prowl after bud break. But once it's up and growing, we have no post herbicides that we can use that won't damage the crop. And I would encourage you, make sure those are really timed appropriately so you're not injuring the crop with those herbicides. Grass seed, I think anything in hay production would fit in grass seed production, but they're not labeled for grass seed production. So we have a lot of grass seed production up in the Bighorn Basin, native and non-native grass seed production. I'm not aware of much here in Riverton. Is there quite a bit of grass seed in the area? No? Anyway, if you did have some, so I'd be looking at small hay production or small grains, herbicide, to look into that. But they're not labeled for grass seed production, so you need to be looking in, reading your labels, make sure you can apply them. And the other thing is, they could impact the seed production part of them because various to small grains of that. Non-crop sites, Garland, Remedy, Clarity, we could use those. Mowing and tillage, these would work, but be aware they're not gonna, all they do is prevent seed production, right? We're trying to reduce the seed production and spread. It's not going to kill the plant outright, right? It is unclear. We have not been able to distinguish for those ditches or canals or anything that way what herbicides are labeled for application of those ditches. So if you find something or know of a label or read a label, let us know. We'd like to know about that. But overall, my biggest message is just get out there and look, scout your fields. Watch your roadsides. If you see a pigweed plant that looks weird, looks different, check it out. It could be Palmer amaranth, and then contact your field men and your weed and pest. Try and work with them as much as you can. That's all I got for you guys. Any questions?
So, like right now, I mean, I'm new to this space, but it almost is like a cheatgrass. I mean, in terms of it's replanting itself very early before anybody else, any other of the noxious weeds, and then it just continues to take over area, more ground. And what we've been doing is that use pre-emergent, right? Put down a good pre-emergent, and hopefully that will, control it. I mean, this sounds like it's almost like a losing battle, really. I mean,
it is, and that's usually the message behind it. Yep.
Yeah. So it's pervasive in the Corn Belt, the Midwest. So what do? They just have a good regimen of tilling and
Yep.
and keeping it into the soil to prevent it from actually spreading. And managing it, I guess.
Yeah, it's their management. So if you go back in the Midwest, mostly they're not doing tillage anymore.
Okay.
They are, a lot of the Corn Belt and the Midwest, even Nebraska has
Right.
gone to no-till or strip-till. And so that it is what it is, let's put it that
Okay.
way. And so there is no benefit from the no-till, right? This is a very small seed. It lays on the soil surface, germinate quickly, and get up and growing. With us here where we're tilling, tillage is good. If we bury that seed, that's going to be beneficial to us. So that can be a management
Okay.
technique. So if I have a field that gets away from me, I'd want to till that if you're able to in your management to bury that seed. The problem is, at least up in the Bighorn Basin, we till every year. And so if you till it the following year, you're bringing those seeds right back to the surface. So I want to say the seeds can lay dormant for 3 to 5 years. So if we're going to use tillage as an effective means, we'd have to roll that soil, leave it there for that time period to try and kill at least a percentage of the seeds before we bring it back
So,
up.
but if you did that and then you put down a pre-emergent, is that going to help it?
Yep.
I mean,
That year, it would help that year.
so then you just could have to continue that process
Yep.
as the crop evolves or as the weed evolves, you're evolving with it, basically.
Correct. So the Midwest, the Corn Belt, even in the South, Mississippi, Alabama, essentially what they're using is pre-emergent herbicides, overlapping those, having as much residuals as they can, and then hitting it with post-emergent herbicides after their pre-emergents run out. And they're trying to just control and keep the pressure on as much as they can throughout as long of the growing season as they can. Different than cheatgrass. So I would not compare this to cheatgrass.
Okay.
So cheatgrass is a fall annual, right? So it's going to germinate in the fall,
Right.
overwinter as a seedling, and then explode in the spring and get up and get growing before everybody else.
Right.
This is an annual. This is a summer annual. It's going to germinate, late May, early June, I would suspect. And then once it starts germinating, it just keeps growing
Keeps going.
until the freeze and frost.
Okay.
The next year, you're starting from seed again. So it's similar but different than cheatgrass. They're
Right.
both annuals, it's just the timing of their germination
Right.
windows are different.
Okay.
Yeah. But it is progressive. It'll take over and that's that explosive population, right?
Okay.
Once you get a few plants in the field this year, you're okay, you'll get by this year, but next year, what they've seen is the tillage and especially the harvest equipment, like combines, drags it throughout the field and spreads it throughout the field
Right.
to where you went from a few plants at this end of the field, next year now it's throughout the entire part of the field. And that's before we include like birds moving that seed around.
Yeah, it's
So
crazy how fast, I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's what I got, thank you.
Thank you.